I honestly think as elected officials, you all are inherently planners. Now, the opposite is not necessary. Thankfully, not all planners are inherently elected officials. But you are all, I think, at heart planners. It's why you're here. It's why you do the awesome jobs that you do, and we certainly appreciate it. But we are embarking, you being planners, on, I think, a really extraordinary planning process. We are planning now for the year 2050. Over the next 12 months, you are going to have really invoked one of your primary responsibilities as Congress identified 50 years ago in establishing this MPO in 1974. One of your primary responsibilities serving on this board is basically coming up and endorsing and adopting a metropolitan transportation plan for the region over the next 20 years. We're required by the federal government to have a 20-year planning horizon. We're in the year 2024, so we are in 2050. And I do think this will be an extraordinary process. We will be at the midpoint of the century. Mayor Parker had some great data. She didn't get it from me, but she was all on point. We will pass the 12 million point before 2050. I'll show you these numbers. And it really represents a remarkable opportunity, but it also is going to be a significant challenge. Dallas, Tarrant, Collin, Denton County, all 30 by 30 square miles. We will see Dallas and Tarrant counties reaching their holding capacities. Generally, we think that's in the 3 to 3.5 million people. We will see population in Dallas and Tarrant Collin and Denton exceeding 2 million. And all of you that have sort of been sitting out there on the perimeter for the last 20 years, being thankful that you don't have the kind of congestion problems the core counties have. A new day is coming. All of you, growth is going to be moving into the perimeter counties, and you'll see that as these forecasts move forward. And so it will be a remarkable planning opportunity for all of us. It's all about maintaining quality of life. How do we make sure if we're a region of 12.5 million people in 2050, we stay the region that we are today? So the first step in this process, every time we go through this, is to decide how big are we going to be? What are we planning for? This is an easier step. The more complicated step that we're all heavily involved in, and I'll start bringing to you over the next coming months, is where are all of us going to be in this planning horizon? But one of the things we've always done is we rely on what we call national experts, folks that look at Dallas-Fort Worth in the context of our regional economy relative to other metropolitan areas across the United States. Yes, it is expected that we may actually pass Chicago in this planning horizon. New York at 18 million, LA at 16 million, Chicago around 9 to 9.5. Yes, I think Dallas-Fort Worth in this planning horizon will be the third largest metropolitan area, and Houston will be right on our tails. They generally stayed about 500,000 people behind us over the last 30 years. So we've always relied heavily on external sources who really do national models. A lot of these are econometric models. A lot of these are studies of population growth and dynamics. And so the first step in this process is to endorse what we believe is our control total. Now, demographic forecasts in this region are adopted by the North Central Texas Council of Governments Executive Board. Because demographics have a much more far-reaching impact than just transportation, these demographics are used for all sorts of planning throughout the counties and local governments and the purposes here at COG. And it does provide, we think, the appropriate level of separation between the COG board, who develops the demographic forecasts, and you all who develop the transportation plans and all the things that you touch to support that. I'm going to take you real quickly through a process. We really challenged our demographers, and this includes our Research and Information Services Group, which we have a great partnership with. Their general background is demographics and economics, and our transportation group to take a deep dive into where we're at on our regional control totals. You will see throughout this presentation a reference to Perryman and Associates. This is an econometric forecasting firm that we have used for the last 2 decades that have really drive our estimates of how Dallas-Fort Worth will compete from an economic standpoint. You all know this. It's all about jobs. Jobs is why we are here. Jobs is why we've grown the last 40 years, and jobs will be the determining factor on how we grow the next 30 years. But first, if we take a look at population, this is was about a 60-slide presentation, all the work these folks have done over the last 6 months. I've tried to narrow it down to about 10 slides. There'll be more opportunities over the next several months, but I'm going to just try to hit the high points for you. One of the things we take a really close look at is how is Dallas-Fort Worth doing when we compare to the state of Texas. Here's a growth of Texas from 1970 out through our planning horizon. And you can see through a variety of sources, which I'll touch on in a minute, the state of Texas has obviously grown dramatically and will continue to grow dramatically. One slide I didn't include because it's really complicated. Lots of numbers, but what share is Dallas-Fort Worth population compared to the state of Texas in this horizon? In 1970, DFW was about 13% of the state's population. Today, we are more than 26%, so we have more than doubled in our share of population relative to the rest of the state. And so one of the big questions we're looking at was, well, based on how Texas is growing and that share, how do we expect that we're going to continue to grow? The curves and the growths are very similar if you look at it. And I'll talk for a second about the sources of information we look at. There's a variety. You can see the orange line, that's the Perryman forecast that we're basically checking everything against. We did a lot of work to look at the growth. If you look at statistically, we have lots of great data now from 1970 through 2024. We can do linear analysis of growth. It's not linear. Our growth is not in a straight line. It's more in what we call a trend polynomial. That's a statistical analysis where they look at historically how we're going to grow. Ironically, that trend polynomial line pretty much tracks the Perryman work. We look closely at a group in Austin called the Texas State Data Center. They're primarily focused on population, not jobs. And they look very closely at something called in-migration. And they do scenarios. The 0.5 in-migration is for the state of Texas to have half as much in-migration over the forecast period as we've had historically. The 1.0 is to continue basically at the same rate. In-migration is still a huge issue driving our economy. We know in some of the last data we looked at, Collin County, for example, over 60% of the growth that occurs in Collin County is largely still due to in-migration. And it's not unique to Collin County, but they have some of the highest in-migration rates. So the question is, how will we continue to stack up? We also spent some money, and we talked to the folks at Woods & Poole. They're a national econometric firm. Their forecasts are shown on here. They're more in the middle of the pack from these three alternatives. But you can see all five of these lines, maybe with the exception of the Texas Data Center, where we don't believe the in-migration is going to slow as much as that scenario would suggest. But this shows you the range of forecasts that we're looking at. One of the things we spend a lot of time looking at also is compound annual growth rates. It's something you have to be very careful about. It's certainly a driving factor in demographic growth. Remarkably, from 1970 through the year 2020, our region has sustained a compound annual growth rate of population of over 2%. There are very few metropolitan areas around the country that can show that rate of growth. The question is, do we expect to continue to grow at that rate through the planning horizon? If we do, the numbers become somewhat staggering. The footnote is that we would actually be 15.2 million by the year 2050. We are at 8 million today. Let's hope we don't double in population in that time frame. So we're actually anticipating and quite frankly hoping in some ways that we don't maintain that. But then 19 million through 2060. So compound annual growth rates are something that we're paying a lot of attention to. These are the range of forecasts. I'll come back to our recommendation here in a moment, how we stack up against Perryman. I won't go through all these, but you can see the lowest forecast in the Texas Data Center, about 9.6 million, all the way through what we called our derived forecast, and some of the others get you as high as 12.6. But I've also showed you, because we actually carried this analysis out through 2060 because we have data for these years, but you can start to see what the data looks like in the 2060 horizon. Employment, very similar. We stack very similar patterns up statewide against employment. Again, Texas continued to grow. This is an area where the Woods & Poole folks are much more aggressive about what our employment can be in the state of Texas and follow the same pattern in Dallas-Fort Worth. They may be right. We think this is probably an over-optimistic assessment of employment growth. We've actually had meetings with them, spent a lot of time talking about some of the assumptions they put into that. But certainly in this case, they represent the highest of these scenarios. And you can see the Perryman line runs somewhat optimistically through the center, but matches some other linear trends that we've done, or statistical trends that we've done. And they are all above what we would consider to be the straight line growth, the linear trend. Again, even more staggering, how have we done on annual compound annual growth rates from employment perspective? Nearly 3%. I presented to STAC. We had a presentation from the Federal Reserve Bank last year about economic growth. For a region to maintain economic growth of greater than 3% on an annual basis is really almost unheard of. It is remarkable by any stretch that we've been able to continue to do that. Will we continue to do that in the future? Again, if we do, our employment by 2050 would be 12.6 million, 2060, 16.9 million. We don't think that we will be at that rate, but it's not without the realm of possibility. So these are the range of employment numbers that you would see through different sources. Again, Perryman sits at about 8.6 million, Woods and Poole, much more aggressive at 9.8, and then our other derived and polynomials and other statistical analysis support that we would be somewhere near the Perryman analysis, around 8.5 million people. A big factor that we've always looked at over the years is the ratio between population and employment. This is difficult because this is something that's changed over the last 50 years. When you had a single worker in a household, when the mom was staying at home, obviously your population employment ratios were much higher. As we've got more and more workers per household and more workers per capita, the P/E ratio has fallen. The question is, how low do we think it will go? There's a lot of debate about that. We think somewhere around 1.4 is about as low as realistically we think that needs to be. That's where the Perryman forecast shows us. You can see the Woods and Poole estimates take it quite a bit lower. That's one reason we don't think that's quite right. But we are tracking, we think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.4 in our P/E ratio. And you can see different assumptions about P/E ratios. I won't go through all these, but generally these fall in the ratio of 1.4 to 1.6 when you look at different sources. So where have we ended up? We think actually our Perryman forecasts are tracking pretty much where we think we need to be. We're going to recommend to the COG Executive Board that we plan for a population control total of 12,429,000 with about 8.7 million jobs. And that would be our recommended control total moving forward. You can see what those numbers look like. That's a 55% increase in population over where we're at in 2022, a 48% increase in jobs with a P/E ratio of about 1.43. So the next presentation I'll bring to you, and when we start down to the devils in the details and the complexity of this, is, okay, where will we all be? And as I said in my opening remarks, in this 12.5 million population threshold and 8.5 million, 8.7 million jobs, we really start to see the challenge of density and where are we going to put growth. You all live it today. The idea of higher density, whether it's through mixed use or high-rise residential, all of you have fought the battles around your council tables about the challenges related to density and how that affects your community. And it was going to continue to be a huge challenge for us as we look at the distribution of activity. But we feel pretty comfortable about these forecasts moving forward. We always sort of take the approach of optimistic, but also not being unrealistic. And so that's the balance that we try to achieve. And with that, I'd be happy to open for questions. And